Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, John, for the interesting keynote. Indeed, mathematicians cannot compute. And computer scientists rather let computers compute. And I'm part of the people that think that computers can do a lot more also for cities. And along that, we're gonna have the second panel on the digital cities. Is it risk or potential for sustainable development? So I'm computer scientist. I'm heading Fraunhofer Institute for Open Communication Systems. It's on information and communication technologies. And recently I became member of the German Advisory Council on Global Change. I'm very happy about that because having worked on smart cities, I see, well, the potentials like the risk, and thought we need to have a lot more discussion and dispute about where we want to develop our urban environments to. So what are the guidelines, what are the limits, what are the thresholds where we should aim at or which we should avoid? And along that, of course, I see, well, I appreciate, for example, the new urban agenda, but I also believe that it doesn't talk enough about the potential of the digital transformation. So I'm happy that along the transformative power of cities, we now have this panel on digitization. And I'm very happy to welcome the two panelists. You see, it's just two, not three. Andreas Knie from Berlin excuses himself, gives you best greetings, and I don't know, he is, so to say, rushed up with other work. But I think we're gonna have, well, great panelists which take up the time. And anyway, everyone wanna talk more and can talk more. So we have now panelists from US and from India, so quite different perspective. Carlo is from the MIT, director of the SENSEable City Lab, so something I guess you have heard about already or known for, well, great experiments, great developments, interesting insights, for example, about how waste is traveling around the world, just with some sensors and some computers and visual computing. Anyway, so I hand over the floor to Carlo, and later on I introduce to you also Shivani Chaudhry from India. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Great pleasure to be back with you here in Berlin. And you know, I didn't know. Can we have the slides? Actually, I didn't know it, but actually somehow, you know, the beginning of my presentation is kind of continuation of John's beautiful overview on cities. And you know, but taking a bit more like the digital hat on me. And I wanted to start with this picture because in the 1990s, at the beginning of the digital revolution, people thought that, you know, cities would become more and more virtual, that this would be our future, really, everything being virtual. So much so that at the time, some people thought the cities themselves would disappear. This is Gilder, an American writer. He writes in 1995. That's the same year when Nicholas Negroponte writes Being Digital. And Gilder says, you know, we are headed for the death of cities. Cities are leftover baggage from the industrial era. Well, what does this tell you? The first thing it tells you is never make predictions about the future. Because no prediction could have been more wrong than this one. And we've seen it in John's beautiful presentation before, you know, how much cities have been growing. That's a picture from China. This is Tianjin. China this century might actually build more urban fabric than all of humanity ever built before. We know that since 2008, half of the world's population lives in cities, and this number actually might swell to 5 billion by 2030. So what has happened is digital hasn't really killed our need to meet in physical space. to have cities. I think also today's meeting, you know, the fact that we are here physically to exchange ideas and so on is the same reasons why we get to cities. When cities started at the beginning, 5,000, 10,000 years ago, first small settlements and then 5,000 years ago, they're really a way to bring us together so that in physical space we can make sure that the total is more than the sum of the individual parts. So digital hasn't changed that, they're still there, but the interesting thing is that digital and physical recombining are changing many dynamics in our cities. And I think so based on today's panel, I wanted to explore and share with you some of these changes, especially in the direction of sustainability. I wanted to start with one of the oldest projects we did. It's a project that we showed at the Venice Biennale now 10 years ago. And that was the first time ever when we took data in real time coming from a big cell phone network for millions and millions of people, anonymized data in real time in order to try to understand better the city. You know, in the past we could understand the physical structure of the city. Nolli in 1749 does the famous Nolli map of Rome that actually helped us to understand the physical structure. But the old dream of understanding life inside the city is something many dreamed about in the past, but wasn't possible till recently. It has become possible just because all of us now have some digital bits in our pockets, and then this allows us to better understand the city. So what we did in this case was actually we took a city, it was the city of Rome. We started getting anonymized information from millions of people through the cell phone network in the city of Rome. We would send that to MIT, where we would analyze it in real time, process it, and then show it to the public. We wanted to share it with the public because we thought this was like a new potential for understanding cities, also a potential that would raise a number of questions about privacy and so on. And so we wanted to show this in a public exhibition that was the Venice Biennale in 2006. Now, I'll show you now something from that year that actually I don't show this project much anymore, but we are in Germany, and that year, you know, we were mapping the city of Rome, and something very important happened for Italians here in Germany. It was the World Cup, that when Italy won the soccer World Cup, it was Italy and France playing for the final, and look at what happened in the city of Rome during the final. So this is just the basic data, no analytics, but you see this is before the match, you see Rome, you see the river, the Colosseum, people moving here and there in the course of the day. This is the afternoon. Still before the match, in a moment you'll see the match begins. Now, silence, nobody talks anymore. France scores, Italy scores, half-time, people make a call and go to the bathroom. Second half, end of normal time, first overtime, the second. There was a famous headbutt by Zidane, it's here, and finally, Italy wins. So that night, everybody goes to celebrate over there in the center. The following morning, again, everybody goes to meet the winning team and the prime minister. You'll see it over there. Then by the end of the day, everybody goes to a place called Circo Massimo, where Romans have been celebrating now for thousands of years. It's down there in the lower part of the image, and you will see a peak over there going up. But, you know, but this was about how we can understand a city today in a way we couldn't before. This is similar data. It's a visualization that was a MoMA in New York done by Pedro Cruz from our lab at MIT. This is Lisbon, captured using billions and billions of data points from the taxi network. So it tells you how flows of movement happen in the city. And then if we use this information that, again, we couldn't get just 10 years ago or just a few years ago, but we can get today, we can discover interesting things. So the same data you saw before from Lisbon is this. This is New York, very similar, is taxi data. Every dot, a yellow dot, is a taxi pickup or a taxi drop-off. This is JFK Airport. For those of you who've landed in New York, you probably landed and taken a taxi, one of those dots, and then if you zoom out, JFK is down here, and then you see Manhattan and all of the boroughs. And then we ask ourselves, well, what if people were ready to share mobility more? You know that today we like to share many things in our lives. We like to share apartments on Airbnb, couches on couch surfing platforms. So what if people were ready to share more mobility? And if you look at mobility between those 2 points in Manhattan, you got hundreds of thousands of trips that could potentially be shared. Now, if you want to answer that question, if you try to answer it with traditional mathematical approaches, you fail just because of the sheer amount of data. When you get to big data, you also need to try out new ways in order to analyze it. So what we did here with some colleagues, like we've done a lot of work with Santa Fe Institute at John, where John was, and with Jeffrey West and that. In this case, we also collaborated with somebody from Santa Fe, who's Steven Strogatz, who's at Cornell University, a mathematician. And here we developed this idea of a shareability network to answer the question I was telling you. And the question, if you want to frame it mathematically, you frame it like this. You say, imagine you want to take everybody to destination when they need to be there, give or take a small delta. The delta is a small delay you can tolerate. Say 1, 2, or 3 minutes. You can change it. Then what is the minimum number of vehicles you need if you assume that people are ready to share? And then if you develop these shareability networks, they look a bit like this. They show you how many trips could potentially be combined. And you see here different deltas. If the delta is a bit longer, if you tolerate a slightly longer delay, then more trips can be shared. When you analyze it, then when you turn this problem is a way to turn a dynamic problem into a static one. So you get the network that tells you all the possible shareable trips, and then you perform an optimization on that network. And when you do that, you find something interesting, that in New York, if people were ready to share, then you could cut 40% of the taxis we have today and still take everybody to destination exactly when they need to be there, give or take 2 or 3 minutes. Now, I'll tell you 2 interesting stories that happened following these results. The paper here is from 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago maybe, but the first results came out a bit earlier, and they came to the attention of Uber. And since then, we started a collaboration with Uber, and as you might know, Uber Pool does exactly that, allows 2 trips to be shared by 2 people. The other thing that's interesting is when the paper was published, somehow the New York Times saw it and wrote a review about the paper. And they said, well, this is interesting mathematics, but, no New Yorker wants to share anything else with any other New Yorker, let alone a car. Well, it turns out that now that we're working with Uber and analyzing their data, Uber Pool has been a huge success. If you take San Francisco, over 50% of all trips in San Francisco actually happen by people sharing, by pooling, by 2 different people going more or less in a similar direction or in a way that could be combined. And then they share the same car, the result being that there's 1 less car on the road, which means less infrastructure, less energy embedded in the vehicle, less consumption, and less pollution. So what we are seeing now is that this is San Francisco, but also is working in many other cities around the world. I'll show you in a moment. I will not tell you now yet about what our students are very passionate about. It's about seeing how you can combine this and Uber Pool with Tinder or Grindr. That's a different story. But what you see here is how you can scale this. The first question was, this applies to New York, it's a very special city. Will it apply in other cities as well? That's a paper from a few weeks ago where we looked at many, many cities around the world, and we actually developed something we call like a global, well, it's a generalized scaling law of urban ride sharing. So in a way that you can take a city, it's just some simple parameters, you can see how many trips could be shared over there. Well, this is about what is mathematically or in research you call ride sharing, sharing the same ride in going from A to B. But there's something else that could be very, very interesting that's going to happen very soon in mobility, which is not only ride sharing, but vehicle sharing. If you want, you can call it car sharing. Vehicle sharing, you take a car, you use it, and somebody else can use it. If you think about today, a car in the United States is used on average only 5% of the time. 95% of the time, not only it is not used, but actually the car itself uses valuable public land in our cities. It is parked somewhere. So if we change a little bit that, again, we can have a much more efficient system. And the way this is happening is that the car is becoming more sophisticated, like a computer on wheels. That's actually all of the sensors that you have inside a car today is part of a piece of research we are doing with Volkswagen. You got, on an average car, 2,000 sensors in the car that get data in real time. And then you'd add 2 additional sensors, like the 2 you see here, which is some kind of LiDARs and cameras. LiDARs and cameras, the LiDAR does a 3-dimensional scan of the city, like this. You feed all of this into an artificial intelligence system, and then magically a car starts driving itself. And this is not the future, as many of you know. This is today, or this is almost the past. This is from last year, Uber testing self-driving cars in cities with people inside. Singapore has the first fleet, we've been working with the government, has the first fleet of self-driving cars that anybody can use, and many car manufacturers in Germany, all over the world, working on this technology. Now, the interesting thing is that when you got a self-driving car, the car can give you a lift in the morning when you go to your office, and then can give a lift to somebody else in your family or to anybody else in the city. So what you're doing, you're developing a new system which is in between public and private transportation. Now, if you take this, the sharing of the vehicle itself, with what we saw before, the sharing of the ride itself, the combination of both could give you cities such as Berlin or New York or Singapore or Vienna, a big city or a small city, where you can actually take everybody to destination with just a fraction of the infrastructure we have today. And that fraction is something around 20% of the infrastructure we have today. I'm not saying this is going to happen. Other phenomena could come into play that could be quite dangerous. This could become so cheap that people will not want to use the subway anymore. So in that case, you might even get more traffic. But potentially, here we can actually use our infrastructure in a more efficient way. And these 2 points about how digital allows us to better understand what is accessible in terms of infrastructure and then use it better is just a common theme that can apply to many dimensions of urban living. Just as a little exercise about how things might change in the future, I want to share with you also some other things when everything will be self-driving. Something like this might change in our cities. You're all familiar with this. It's a well-known traffic light. And traffic lights appear on our streets when actually cars appear on our streets. But if you think about a system where every car knows where it is and where all the other cars are, then you don't need to stop anymore. You can keep on going just without bumping into other cars. A little bit like this. Don't try it yet. I gave a presentation some time ago in Naples, and they told me, so what is new here? This is a quote from a famous Italian minister who said that in Milan, traffic lights are instructions. In Rome, they're suggestions. In Naples, they are Christmas decorations. So again, this mathematically, this is quite interesting. When you study this, the intersection seems very simple. But from a mathematical point of view, you got different frequencies of arrival, you got different trajectories. And if you want to generalize it mathematically, it's quite interesting. So this is a paper we did, is from a paper we did a year ago, more or less, where we looked at generalizing the intersection by generalizing queuing theory, extending queuing theory so that it could be used to deal with this problem. And what you see here, for instance, is a real intersection in Singapore. In this intersection, you've got the same number of vehicles to the left and to the right. To the left, they are managed using the most sophisticated traffic light system we have today. And to the right, they're managed using a slot-based system. And if you look at this, look at the difference in terms of number of vehicles waiting or delays on the system to the left and to the right. It's interesting because the intersection usually is the key bottleneck in a traffic network. Usually the intersection, you got two flows competing for the same real estate. So if you manage to solve the intersection problem, then they can actually trickle down on the whole network. So it becomes something that can have an effect across the whole city. Well, I'll just briefly, I want to share with you also some of the impact in terms of architecture on the city. Well, we know that the city of the 20th century was shaped by the automobile. We saw it in a very vivid way, also in some of the previous slide by John. And if you think about this, how will the new mobility systems shape the city? And just a couple of things from some of the design projects we've been involved with. This is a project in Singapore. One of the key consequences that we are now quantifying mathematically is about the reduced number of parking that we might need in the future. We still don't know exactly, but most likely if you use cars better, if instead of using them, as I said before, just 5% of the time and parking them, leaving them parked 95%, we need much less parking space. Which means it could also reclaim a lot of space in our cities, maybe to be turned into green spaces. But also parking spaces could be converted. And so this is a parking space we've been designing in Singapore, where we looked at how tomorrow this could be turned into something else. What you want to do, you put the distance between the floors a bit higher. You want to move the ramps outside, so that same space could be converted into other activities. And the other thing I want to share with you also, because we're here in Berlin, is some very exciting work we had the privilege of doing for IBA in Heidelberg. In IBA in Heidelberg, we started thinking about, IBA in Heidelberg is about reconverting. IBA, as you might know, it's Internationale Bauausstellung. There were 2 of them in Berlin. They shaped the city of Berlin over the 20th century. This year, Heidelberg is running the IBA. And part of the IBA is in an old village that was used by the Americans. It's called PHV. And when we started looking at, can we actually look at converting this in a way where we don't need to demolish and rebuild much, but in a way we can go from pure consumption to something where the sharing is at the base of the design of the village. And this was just the first concept phase we developed, was shown with the team and with the city, with all the citizens, and discussed at a number of meetings over the past months. But really, can you think about what would it mean if you had to design a city from scratch, or to refurbish an existing city, like here, or a chunk of the city, like PHV, and where you were to put the sharing at the core. And the sharing means you can use much better the infrastructure across many dimensions. It's about mobility, but the same thing you can apply also for many public spaces, for all those things, again, that we use in our lives just at 1, 2, 3, 5% of the time, but we still have them. We have a party with friends in our big dining room, maybe once a week, but all the rest of the time is unused. So can we actually try to share more in order to use better the infrastructure? And this was the key principle behind the design of the city. The final thing I wanted to mention as we wrap up was the project that was mentioned before. Again, to look at another dimension of sustainability, in this case, by looking at waste and digital. And so we started a few years ago looking at this problem about this computer here on the table. So if you take this computer, today you know everything about it. Every chip in this machine, you know where it was produced, how it moved on the planet, how it became this machine. However, a few years from now, you stop using this machine, you sell it, at some point somebody will throw it away. And then you know very little about it. Sometimes this is what happens. A lot of e-waste from Europe shipped illegally to Africa, from the United States to Asia. So our idea was, what if we could actually develop a little tag to put on trash and start following trash? A little bit like when you go to hospital, they put a tracer in your blood and they follow it through your body. How to do the same thing at the scale of an entire city. Now, we couldn't find any tag off the shelf, so we engineered the tag. It's like a miniature cell phone with 2 conditions. One is that the batteries need to last for a long time, so for many, many months. And the second is that it doesn't need to have all the functionalities of a cell phone, but simply to record its location using different systems, not only GPS. If you are in a truck, the GPS is not enough. It doesn't work anymore, so you want to use GPS in fingerprinting, which is a way to scan all of the spectrum around yourself to position, to get your position. And then you get this information, and then you send it back onto the cloud. Now, I'll show you the first deployment we did was in Seattle. We had 500 volunteers who came with 3,000 pieces of trash. We put a tag on all the pieces of trash. Anything from banana peels to e-waste. And after tagging all of them, we started following them. So these are 3,000 objects, the day of deployment in Seattle. After a few days, you saw appearing some of the main landfills next to Seattle. But actually a big surprise, how far stuff started to travel. Sometimes in crazy, unpredictable ways. Look at a trace that went to Chicago, changed its mind, and went back to California. And it's still moving after 1 month or 2 months. Incidentally, what you saw there is also a self-similar system, is also a fractal system. There's something really embedded in the way we move over space, which is fractal. You know, most of the mobility networks on the planet are fractal. And cities, I think, are kind of our fractal is a response to that, the way we move and create networks in order to move us from one place to another place. But if you look at this, what can you do? The first thing you can do is that you can use all the data, try to analyze it, and then discover interesting things. I will not show the results, but there's a few papers we did where we looked at all the data, and we discovered something like that in some cases we're putting more energy into moving things around than what we will ever be able to recover by recycling. So the first thing, again, it's a way to get big data about waste, use it to better understand the system, and then possibly run different type of optimization on the system. The second thing that's very important is that this data you can share with people, and then data per se can be a very powerful agent of change. So if people know if we know the consequences of what we do, then we can behave in a different way. And we got another paper that was less mathematical, but looked more at the response of people. We went with questionnaires and asked, did this project change the way you're consuming or the way you're recycling? And it looked like, many people had a change because of the results and looking at the impact they were having on the planet. Big data means we know more about the consequences of what we do, and so it can help us to change our behavior. The third thing that we discovered is that many tags would end up next to the borders of the United States, so next to ports, and then would disappear. And we couldn't track them anymore. In the first deployment, we were just looking at domestic United States SIM cards, so we were not able to follow the tags outside the United States. So over the past couple of years, we've been doing a follow-up project that led us to discover places such as this one in the middle of the jungle in Asia. We've been working with an NGO that focuses on waste and illegal waste. You see here, you find all of them on the website. You can click on each of the traces. Those are all traces of e-waste from the United States being shipped across the world. Some of those traces are legal, some of them are not legal. But again, the idea that big data means that we know more about the planet. We know more about, in this case, about the global issues. And then if we know more, then we can take action in different ways. First, just by putting pressure on politicians, or second, by actually analyzing much better what is going on and then trying to find different type of solutions. So again, the idea that big data means can help us in order to transform the conditions and the situation on the planet. The final thing we discovered was totally unexpected. And it happened by accident. It happened when a burglar came to our lab at MIT. And this poor guy stole a lot of things and also took some of the tags and computers that tell you where they go. So this is what happened. Thank you.
Carlo, thank you very much. Well, how to take that? Well, now we have seen the potentials and the prospects of a smart combination of electronics, of computer science, of communication technologies, of mathematics. And of course, there could be also the downside. I'm not sure, but I think taxi data has been hijacked, hacked. I think it was even from New York. I'm not sure if it was your data. But of course, such data could be anonymized, something that we don't want to see. So the question is really, how smart should the smart cities become? Or is it a real smart choice to take up all the approaches that we can think of? And I'm very happy to introduce to you Shivani Chaudhry on that. She is Executive Director of Housing and Land Rights Network, this time in New Delhi, in India. She was before at the Center for International Environmental Law in Washington, and was also a member of the government of India in the Ministry of Rural Development, in particular in the task force on land reforms. And she will now give a view on the digitization from a human rights perspective and reflect the status and public debate on smart cities in India. Indeed, I've been to India on smart cities 6-7 years ago. And if you are in New Delhi, you really think, well, are we doing the right thing for cities like those in Asia? And of course, there need to be other answers to the questions they have, and they have even a different set of questions where rural development, urban development should go to. Please.
A very good afternoon to everyone, and I'd like to begin by first thanking WBGU for organizing this very important conference and for inviting me to come all the way from Delhi to speak today. I'd also like to thank the audience for braving it in the rain and staying with us all day. I know it's late in the evening, so I really appreciate your participation here. In the few minutes that I have, I'm going to raise some concerns and challenges about the conceptual and practical framework around smart cities from my experience in India. Most cities in the world, especially in the global south, as we have seen also raised by some of the speakers before me, are characterized by very stark dichotomies. We have very high levels of economic inequality. We have social inequality, which is increasing with the elite and the powerful and the marginalized becoming more marginalized. We have historically discriminated communities. We have low-income groups. We have spatial dichotomies where people living in the centers of cities actually have access to better infrastructure and services, whereas those living on the peripheries are denied essential services such as housing and access to water, sanitation. And we see a push where the poor are moving further and further out of the cities because of real estate speculation and exorbitant prices of housing. We have administrative dichotomies where you have the city that works for the people who have access to secure tenure, permanent housing, the ones who live in the planned city, the ones for whom the city functions. And you have those who actually make the city function but are considered part of the unplanned city, the ones living in informal settlements, the ones who are homeless. And lastly, we have legal dichotomies where the law actually works for those who it recognizes as residents. And then you have the unrecognized residents living in unrecognized areas of the city who the law actually works against by terming them as illegal residents or encroachers on public space. This is just a visual representation of the dichotomy. You have those who drive on flyovers, part of the planned regularized city, and the homeless who live under the very same flyover. In India, we have a very acute housing shortage, urban and rural. 95% of this of the housing shortage is for low-income groups. So against this backdrop of urban inequality, India launched a Smart Cities mission in 2015, which has very ambitious target of creating 100 smart cities by the year 2020. These 100 cities, of which 90 have already been selected, are selected through a competition Every city submits a proposal which is developed by a consulting firm. Many large multinational firms are the ones developing these smart city proposals, such as KPMG or Pricewaterhouse, and the government selects the best proposal. And there's a very large amount of investment. The consulting firm Deloitte estimates $150 billion to develop these smart cities, of which $120 billion would be required from the private sector. This is a plan for one of the smart cities in southern India. And as you will see, the plans are largely transposed from other parts of the world. So they're characterized by high-rise buildings, multiple flyovers, bright lights, but in no image do you see the people. In no image do you see spaces for the poor, or do you see mixed-income neighborhoods. So really, what are these cities about, and who are they being built for? So I'm just going to raise a few of the human rights concerns. The first issue, and I think this is ubiquitous to smart cities around the world, is the failure of a comprehensive definition. So with the lack of a common understanding or a shared definition, you find that everybody is interpreting smart cities differently, but what is common is that they lack human rights framework at the core. There are no human rights principles integrated in them. There are no standards about how are human rights going to be protected in these cities. There are no commitments based on international and national law. The second problem with the smart city model is that the approach in itself is faulty. It assumes that urbanization is inevitable. It assumes that everybody is going to live in cities. It does not address the structural causes of this rampant urbanization, which by its very nature is very unsustainable. So for example, in Asia and Africa, a large number of people are moving to cities not out of choice, but out of distress, because of the failure to invest in rural areas, because of the huge agrarian crisis, because of the lack of jobs and investment in rural areas. But this model is just pushing a very unsustainable urbanization paradigm without looking at the linkages between urban and rural areas. It's not a very inclusive approach because it's only looking at creating pockets or small enclaves of wealth and high technology. So even when you talk about a smart city, it's not the entire city that is being developed, it's part of the city. So we are building small enclaves at the cost of holistic development of the entire city, at the cost of a balanced, integrated rural-urban development. As I mentioned earlier, these smart city proposals are largely being developed by consulting firms or the elite, and you do not have the voices of the marginalized and low-income groups adequately represented. Nobody has really asked a person living in an informal settlement, is your idea of urban development a smart city? The persons might say, I want secure tenure, I want electricity, I want water and sanitation, before I want a smart city. But the spaces for the participation have been limited, and whatever participation has been accessed has been largely through technological platforms. So there have been online consultations, there have been participation invited through mobile apps, smartphones, but again, the poor and the illiterate do not have access to this technology, so it has kept them out of this process. The next important point is the dilution of democracy. What has happened is that the special purpose vehicles, these are new entities being created to govern smart cities. These are registered under the Companies Act. It is a private entity run by a CEO that is in charge of implementing the smart cities mission. So it is in direct contrast and challenge to your local self-government, to your elected authorities, and how this private entity relates with your urban local bodies is a big question mark, and nobody knows what's going to happen when the private sector starts governing your city. It's a very dangerous trend. The other dangerous trend is that the role of the corporate sector, as I mentioned, about $120 billion are being called in to invest in smart cities. So we see the privatization of essential services, the privatization of housing, increased speculation on property, and a trend of the corporatization of cities, which is something I think all of us need to be concerned about, but it's not surprising because the idea of a smart city has really originated from large companies like IBM and Siemens, who thought of this project as a way of increasing their gains and their profits. And another trend that we're seeing is that it's not just that the poor do not have a say in the development of the smart city has no space for them. So when you look at the plans, as I mentioned, you see high-rise buildings, you see very lavish development. For example, in New Delhi, the proposal is to create a Times Square in the center of the city. I mean, what is Times Square? It's a manifestation of capital, global capital. You know, it's a very market-driven model that we don't really need in the city. But that's what's happening. And in the guise of improved housing, the poor are being pushed further and further out. So we've already seen forced evictions taking place. There's greenfield development being planned, which will cause displacement of rural communities, especially farmers and agricultural workers. And this actually sanctions gentrification and segregation. So it's a model that is promoting gentrification and segregation of the poor. And therefore, it's something that we need to be concerned about. The last concern I will raise is the unrealistic reliance on technology. While technological solutions, as we heard before, can help us, they can create a lot of benefits, they help towards promoting sources of renewable energy, increasing inefficiency, but technology on its own is not going to solve the structural problems of urbanization in the global south, especially when we do not have the infrastructure to support such kind of technological innovation. So if you do not have 24-hour electricity, you cannot have reliance on smart grids, because when your electricity goes, the system crashes. So we have to first make sure that we have the basic infrastructure for everyone in the city before we can start dreaming of developing these smart grids and this growing digitalization. Since this session is on digitalization, I'm going to raise some of the concerns. Carlo mentioned the very positive and exciting potential of digitalization and technology, and I agree with that. There is a lot of scope. But on the other hand, we are dealing with a new field which we do not know enough about. Smart cities are synonymous with big data, but we do not have the adequate policies or frameworks to address this explosion of big data. You know, it's given rise to a plethora of unknown issues, uncharted territory, and given rise to a lexicon of a whole range of new terms, such as digital rights, digital sovereignty, digital intelligence. But most of us do not even understand what all this means. And you know, earlier on, we were people with thoughts, beliefs, views, but now each one of us is generating a digital footprint and a digital shadow. And we have no idea who is looking at this data. We have no idea what it's being used for, and we have no idea who's controlling it. So I think the complete lack of transparency is something that is of great concern. It gives rise to very serious issues of privacy. There is increased surveillance. Everyone is being monitored all the time, and we do not know what happens when this data gets in the wrong hands. There is a very great threat of misuse. We've seen systems being hacked. We've seen when the system crashes, the kind of chaos it can cause. So yes, you can have traffic management systems, but if there's a grid failure, it can cause very serious life-threatening accidents and other kinds of human rights violations. One of these violations is that of profiling, and we have seen how data can be used to profile and discriminate against certain communities. So whether it's profiling based on race, ethnicity, or religion, and then denying certain groups basic services and access to a whole range of resources. So these are very serious threats, and we know that in the guise of anti-terror laws, this has already been happening where certain populations tend to get victimized and profiled, and there are serious threats that we do not know about. Surveillance is also increasing, and there's a big issue of consent, like do I give consent for my personal data to be used? And there is a blurring between personal data and public information, and in this growing public-private partnership city, where the private sector is so involved in governance, the entire relationship of a citizen with the government, with the state, is also changing and blurring. So these are some concerns I think that we need to be aware about, and we do not have the frameworks to address them. According to UNCTAD, about 57% of countries have privacy laws, and less than 40% in Asia and Africa have privacy laws that protect our right to privacy. Most countries are still trying to figure out what's happening, and we don't know. So I think this is giving rise to a growing digital divide between those who have access to this technology, the ones who benefit from the technology, and the low-income marginalized groups who get left behind because they cannot access this technology. So these are some visuals. And who is really benefiting from these cities and who is paying for the cities? And I just want to come back to the first slide that I had on the urban dichotomies. And from the experience that we have so far, it is really the groups in red who are benefiting from this smart city development. And the poor, the ones living on the periphery being pushed further out, the ones living in the unplanned city losing access to even the limited resources that they had, and the poor and marginalized actually not benefiting from this smart city development model, unfortunately, which is being imposed on them. It's not something that they chose. So how do we move forward? I think my first recommendation would be to integrate a very strong human rights approach in all smart city plans. They must match the master plans. They must meet the local and national and international human rights commitments of countries. As Joseph mentioned earlier, the local authorities and governments are also bound by the same international law. We need standards, we need human rights standards that put people at the center, not technology. So technology is good, but it has to work for the people, not against them. And under no circumstances must technology trump human rights. We need balanced rural-urban development, so you must also invest in rural areas at the same time. You create jobs in rural areas. You deal with the agrarian crisis, because the food really is being grown in rural areas, and we need to understand that food security is a very important component of any kind of sustainable development. So we need to protect farmers. We need to ensure that legislation is in place to protect the rights of rural people as well as those living in cities. Gender equality and non-discrimination have to be at the core. We have very high rates of violence against women, not just in the global south, but in all cities around the world. And this issue is not raised enough. So smart cities are largely gender neutral. We need to put women, children at the center. We need to put marginalized groups at the center. And that can only be done if we incorporate human rights principles within the smart city framework. There must be human rights and environmental impact assessments for all projects, whether it is a greenfield development project or it's the use of a new technology. I think technology must be based on local needs, and there must be comprehensive needs assessments to see whether that technological innovation can be sustained by the society, whether we have the basic infrastructure and we have the regulations in place to ensure that it is not misused against people. And we need to have environmental impact assessments, because many of these projects, while claiming to increase sustainability, actually have negative environmental consequences. And there must be the free and prior informed consent of all residents living in a city. And I think we need to ask for accountability, whether it is large companies or governments accessing our personal data and using it for whatever projects. They may be useful projects, they may have benefits, but we need to be informed. And I think the government has to take steps to inform us. We need to regulate the market. I think we had a very interesting panel discussion before this on the need to regulate the housing market, to need to regulate the real estate market, but we have to avoid the corporatization of our cities. Cities have to remain with the people, not with companies. And the thrust for smart cities is really coming from the private sector, because there is so much potential for them to profit from it, but we really need to put people at the center of this development process. We must uphold democratic principles. We cannot have new entities being created that subvert democracy and democratic institutions in many countries. We need to generate awareness of data risks and misuse. As I said, there is no transparency, there's no information. We have no idea of what is happening or how many people are listening into this conversation, or everybody knows where we are because of our smartphones, but what is being done with that data, and is it being used against us? So we need to be aware of the risks. And I think we definitely need to develop adequate data legislation within a human rights framework to ensure transparency and accountability. And lastly, I think we need to have human rights indicators to monitor this kind of development. It has to be linked with international law and international legal commitments, including the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement, because these are very important targets that our countries have all ratified, and we need to ensure that any kind of urban development is in tune with these frameworks that exist. So unless we ensure a human rights approach, I really fear that this trajectory of urban development that has been embraced with so much gusto and speed without really understanding what are the potential risks and harms, especially for the most marginalized, discriminated groups who continue to remain voiceless in these processes. There are serious threats to democracy, to justice, to governance, the rule of law, and mostly for sustainable development of our cities, habitats, and villages. And I'd just like to end with, you know, do we want smart cities or do we want inclusive cities? And Mahatma Gandhi, who you probably heard about from India, he had once told people that whenever you have to make a decision or take a step forward for any action, I request you to think of the face of the most marginalized or poor man or woman you have ever met in your life. And then for a second, contemplate whether the decision you are making is going to benefit that person. And I would just like to end with that, really, whether these smart cities are going to benefit the most marginalized and poor people in our countries. That's something I'll leave you to answer with. And we did a study. So we just did a brief analysis of the smart city proposals in India. I had brought a few copies of the publication, but if you didn't get hold of a copy and you are interested, it's available on our website. So once again, thanks a lot for this opportunity to speak here and for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shivani. Well, first reflection, I'd like really to introduce or to invite you to read also the research papers on smart cities. They started back already, I think in 1960 or 70, you even find already first ideas and thoughts. And they definitely, the people are in the center of the consideration. And yes, there are big companies which now try to make business out of that. And a second reflection, I personally believe that today the development of electrical infrastructure shouldn't be thought any longer without information networking infrastructure, because they too interrelate and shouldn't be separated. Anyway, of course, Carlo, I wonder, how do you see this discussion? No, how can we, so to say?
Can you hear me? Works? Okay. No, I agree. Let me say, so because we're on a panel, so we need to disagree to make it a bit more interesting. So I'll tell you now, I think it's hard to disagree with what was mentioned, but I think what you have behind is it depends what you define as a smart city. So if you define, it is true, what is happening today in India is quite scary because the government launches big plan about 100 smart cities and is mostly big consulting firms having this idea of a smart city that's like an enclave for rich people using a lot of technological gadgets. Now, if you take the definition, then all of that follows. But for me, the definitions should be very, very different. And the definition I would give for a smart city, the term, by the way, the name smart city is terrible, but let's keep it for a time being. That for me is the consequence of something very, very simple and also very, very profound, which is the internet is entering physical space. The internet is becoming Internet of Things, and because of that, is revolutionizing many aspects of our lives. Now, if you look at the application of this on production, that is Industry 4.0. Industry 4.0, as you say. When you say in German, it feels like it's already there. So anyway, so 4.0. Then you got buildings, and then what's happening in buildings is interesting. You got something like Nest, the intelligent thermostat, learns from you, and there's something very, very simple. Now, think about how much energy is wasted in our cities because we heat empty buildings during the winter. We are not at home, we're in the office, but our homes are still, at 20 degrees. Now, something like Nest, very, very simple, very, very, but just Internet of Things device allows you to learns from you when you're not there, temperatures goes down just 5 or 6 degrees, and then it goes up again, and then, you save a lot of energy. So again, you get smart buildings and you get smart cities. So all of these are the same technological change, Internet of Things, and then allow us to change many aspects of our lives. Now, if you take this definition, then I think the picture is different. It's not about the big consulting firms, the IBMs of the world wanted to, as it was mentioned, wanted to conquer our cities and sell products. It is about other things that can empower people. And I'll give you just one example about also how this can have a big impact in the global south. Now, again, this is one of the devices that promoted this kind of Internet of Things condition. The fact we are online, we got information in real time coming to us, and we can actually send out real-time information from something like this. And then for me, it was amazing to see, this thing here. Just 10 years ago, I think I was seeing when I landed in Berlin, I saw the big signs, it's the 10 years of the iPhone. Think about all the ecosystem it has created. We wouldn't have Uber, many other things without this. But just in 10 years, at the beginning, it was something just for the rich. It was an instrument of divide. And then you fast forward, and now today you got a condition on the planet where there's parts of the world where people don't have running water, but have this. And that is allowing very interesting leapfrogging. So the last time I was in Sri Lanka, I saw something amazing that all the fishermen used to be ripped off by how do you call them? By whatever the people who would buy the fish on the shore, who actually knew that they didn't know the price, so would try to rip them off and get the fish with very little. Now, just with something like this, they know in real time the price of the fish, and then they go back and say, "Sorry, the price is higher. Either you pay it or I go to the other place." So there's one simple example of how. And if you go to Africa, you see amazing things done by people making small transactions. They don't have a bank account, but mobile banking is more developed in Africa than here in the United States. So what I'm saying is that what you're seeing, if you take this different definition, which is not the definition of the IBMs of the world conquering the physical city, but it's the definition of Internet of Things, how it can change many aspects of our lives, then you see amazing things happening all over the world, and the ones that are most exciting are the ones that actually narrow the gap, not increase the gap. And I think there's tons of examples, the Sri Lanka, the African, and many, I could go on and on about these type of things.
Yeah, but the question is, how do we make it happen, right? You can define things as you like, but this doesn't mean that it would work in reality. I mean, we can tell the same stories about smart cities in Germany, by the way. It's not only
but I think
tricky in Asia.
No, but I think the way you make it happen is not by thinking that a smart city is something where you need a government to take action, whatever, the government to fund it, and big companies to enter. It's about creating small things that then can actually trickle down in kind of a bottom-up way. So I think if you think about that way, and I think it is happening. Uber is an example of this. It's changing mobility in India. Uber Pool is changing mobility in India. Nest, a very small thing I mentioned before. I agree with what was mentioned in the previous presentation by John. To me, the most amazing thing on the planet today is that despite Donald Trump, the cost in the past 12 months, we've seen plants based on photovoltaic plants, producing energy in a commercial way, so no incentives, no state incentives and so on, for less than $25 per megawatt hour. When that happens, that is more competitive than any other energy source. And it has started to happen in different parts of the world. We've seen it in Mexico, in South America, in other parts of the world. When that happens, if you look at the curve, what is now $25 per megawatt hour there is just a little bit more here, but it's going down very fast. Now, when that happens, that's the most amazing smart city revolution, because you can produce, you manage that energy, you distribute it locally, you create small networks that self-aggregate in a smart way, move the energy from here to there. So I think for me that's one example. When it gets to that price, not even coal can compete with that, and that's going to be the hope we have.
You can take it. No, it's working.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that I'm not against technology or the smartphone, and I agree that they are very good uses. I mean, yes, the smartphone has revolutionized even the way farmers work in India. It has definitely brought a lot of benefits. It's bringing information into people's homes at a rate that we could not imagine. But I do not think that technology and technological innovations have to happen only in smart cities. We can have technological advances in inclusive cities. So the model for technological advances and growth doesn't have to be couched within a smart city framework. And that's my concern, that this very high consumptive pattern doesn't need to go along with these technological innovations. I believe that if we create a human rights city, a human rights habitat where we balance development, you can still have these great technological tools that you're talking about that can help us be more efficient, save energy, help us meet our climate change commitments without causing a discrimination and further impoverishment of a large section of the population.
And sorry to challenge you again. I mean, we see that the technology, from whichever perspective it comes, doesn't make it by itself, right? So there are regulations, there are laws, there are processes being set up from centuries ago. I try to over-exaggerate, and they misfit to the new approaches. Uber, well, if you look behind the scenes, just ignores what is being set up in society in different nations. So I think there's more to that than just saying it will work like that, because we see all the smart, compositional, bottom-up, grassroots initiatives, and they will make their ways through.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think what we're seeing here is actually quite interesting. So what I'm saying is that you don't need big investment for governments. If something has power, if something, it will walk on with its own legs. And if you think of what's happening with solar energy, I think hopefully will walk with its own legs without any incentives. What government should do should actually create sandboxes where we can experiment more. And actually should be very, very attentive to regulation. I think that some of the bad news from last year, think about Brexit, think about Trump. I need to pay attention to what I say, because the last time I said Trump was a bad news, here in Europe, somebody stood up from the audience and started, attacking me. So is there any Trump supporter before I continue? No. Okay. Raise your hands if you like the Donald. Okay, so
we have freedom of speech here.
So anyway, but I think those were kind of two bad news of the past century, and I think those two bad news of the past century have come to a certain extent because of the inability of politics to follow some of the technological changes. Trump's is the wrong answer to a question which is perhaps a good question. He says, let's build a wall against the Mexican. But the problem is not the Mexican, the problem is robots and self-driving cars, but you cannot build a wall against robots and self-driving cars or other things. There was an interesting article in the New York Times a few weeks ago that looked at, said, well, he's talking about coal miners. It was by Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize winner in economics. He's looking at coal miners, but most of the jobs have been lost today, for instance, in shopping malls. They're shutting down because of Amazon. Again, technology changing society, and politics is unable to answer fast. And so what I think we need is a way to have politics and move faster. And to do that, what you want to do is create air of experimentation in politics and so on, in cities, in order to try out new things. We don't have it, there's not a solution we can define from the beginning, but what we can do is create a test system, and then if things work out, then we can expand it. This is a little bit like what China did when China changed radically now 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago, with changing from the old regime to what China is today. And at the beginning they started creating special economic zones. So that's a way of thinking about sandboxes where we can experiment more. So I think that's perhaps a way. But because we've heard a lot of negative things on smart city, which I agree, if we take that definition of smart city, I wanted to say something, just something positive. And which actually starts from, I was very surprised a few months ago. I read something that Pope Francis said, and he said, that the internet is a gift of God. And I think he might be right. And he might be right for this reason. I believe it was Einstein who once was asked, how will the Third World War be fought? And he replied by saying something like, well, I don't know about the third one, but I can tell you that the fourth one will be fought with stones and sticks. So the point is that we cannot afford a third global conflict, and the only way I think we can afford we can avoid a third conflict if we realize how connected we are, how interdependent we are, and networks might play a vital role there. I don't go into the details. If you want, I can go into the details also from a research point of view. But maybe we do it in a moment. But I think perhaps the internet, yes, is the only hope we have to avoid that fate.
So I'm not going to debate whether the internet is a gift of God or not, but I do have a question about the misuse of this data and how do you address the issues of privacy, of consent, of surveillance, of profiling that we're seeing really exploding in ways that we cannot control.
I thought speakers are here to answer questions, not to ask questions. Okay, then first, okay, I'll tell you two things, but we can. So I think that there's two things we need to look at that are very important. One is that yes, we are producing an immense amount of data that's creating like a digital copy of the physical world. Who has access to the data, under which conditions and so on is vital. And today you got big states, big companies have more access than others, and we're creating a situation which can be dangerous, and we need to all be aware of that. And to discuss it at MIT, we've organized for a number of years a forum that we called Engaging Data, where we had the Obama administration, privacy advocates. Last time we had Ed Snowden's lawyer, Noam Chomsky, many people. Saskia was at the last one we did. Saskia Sassen was here before. We need to talk about this because we think that's a very vital, profound thing. We're creating a world where you cannot forget anymore. And we're creating a world where there's actually a lot of inequality based on who knows what about other people. If you got one of these, somebody at the other side of the world knows everything about you. Knows each of these today records thousands of data points every day. Where you are, how you're moving, if you're cycling, if you're biking in the car or something else, what you're buying, all this information. So I think, but you know very little about those people who collect the data. So I think that's a very important question. That's the first one, and the other one is the one you mentioned, which is about hacking. And hacking is as old as telecommunications. As you might know, Marconi, the Italian, who was one of the pioneers behind wireless transmissions, well, it happened to him where he was giving one of the first demonstrations of wireless in London at the Royal Society, that his system was hacked. And actually, there was a guy who was not very happy with his patents and so on, who transmitted scandalized messages to, obscene messages to the scandalized audience of the Royal Society, I believe, in London. That was over 100 years ago. So hacking has been happening all along, and clearly, if you hack just a digital system, nothing happens. If you hack a city, if you hack a self-driving car, somebody can die. So I think that's another very important point we need to look at. So those 2 points are very, very important. But if you go back to the network, I just want to tell you why I think that networks could be important is there was a very interesting piece of research done by a colleague who's now at Harvard called Steven Pinker. And Steven Pinker did a book you might have seen where he looked at violence over the past few thousand years. And you can look at violence by looking at how many people die because of some kind of violent event. How many people are killed by somebody else? And you can look at that by looking at the skeleton of people, and you can actually look at violence, and then you can plot it over the centuries or the millennia. And the interesting thing is that curve is going down very, very fast. Even if you look at the 20th century, with 2 world wars, violence on average has been much lower than in previous centuries. Now, nobody knows exactly what it is. It cannot be genetics, because it's on such a short time frame. And the most plausible explanation for me is the one that has been given by Peter Singer, who's a philosopher at Princeton, who wrote in a book this idea of the expanding circle. If you take 2 identical twins, they apply to each other the golden rule of morality. I don't do to you what I don't want that you do to myself. And then if you take this, then you got the idea that you got an identity and you got circles of, call it empathy, that actually expand inside groups. Now, and at one point, the circle of empathy breaks. You see somebody like the enemy, and then that's when war starts. The war starts. And actually, it's interesting. Some of you might have read Primo Levi's book on If This Is a Man. And then in the introduction of the 2nd edition, he says, concentration camps starts exactly when you look at the diversity, when you stop the circle of empathy. And well, if you look at this, then I think connecting us or bringing us together with networks is probably one of the only hopes. It's something they can actually make us realize we're all on this together, and we need to get out of this and some of the problems together. So that was the point about the network.
Thank you. So before I give my last question to Shivani, well, I will then open the floor to you so you could think already about questions. So, of course, I thought with the power of networks, you also wanted to say that the more nodes we have, the more powerful it becomes, so, which is, of course, very much supported by the internet, which results in all those exponential effects we see. But I wondered, Shivani, you said we need to develop policies to address the explosion of data. In that respect, I thought, well, shouldn't maybe nothing do about the explosion of data, but rather find ways how to cope with data, no matter if it's big or small.
Yeah, I just think we need to have some regulatory frameworks, as I said, you know, privacy protection laws and awareness laws and information laws, because I think the right to information is something that is also eroded with this kind of misuse and the potential of the data going into the wrong hands. So I think I'm especially worried about privacy and profiling and the use of data to single and out certain groups of people and to attack them. And you know, even if that comes in the wrong hands, it's very alarming. So how do we ensure that citizens have access to information, and companies are also bound by those same laws, so that they are under an obligation to be transparent as to who is using the data and for what purposes. So yes, we know that advertisers use it and then they send us advertisements based on our, you know, social history in terms of what we buy and what we use. But in terms of other aspects of our lives, we do not really know who is using the data and what it's being used against. For example, now there are projects around the world, you know, where biometrics are becoming very important. So your identity is linked with your biometrics. But we find, again, that your fingerprint may not be unique, because for a person who works, you know, in a mine, their fingers are eroded. So today their fingerprint reading might be different tomorrow. But these are not issues that people think about. Or people who work under very strong sunlight, their iris gets eroded over time. So we have a woman who is profiled, you know, for a biometric card, but when she goes to access the benefits, it doesn't read her iris anymore because, you know, of the physical environment that has impacted her eyesight. So suddenly, when you rely so much on this kind of technology, people become non-people very quickly, and you know, there's identity theft. There are all kinds of risks that I feel we need to have some kind of frameworks to just firstly make us aware about them, but then also to regulate it and not put so much dependence on that technology. Because, you know, these were things that we had in movies where, you know, your identity gets stolen and suddenly you're not a person anymore. But these are threats that, you know, we are seeing happening, not just
I see a little different, indeed, because the technology comes with potentials, and potentials come with risk. Right, so even you said we should have human rights indicators for monitoring. Should best be realized again with in digital approach. So it's a dilemma, right? So and the question is, where do we put the, I don't know, the threshold, the border? I don't know. Well, what are the guidelines we need to get in place worldwide and locally? Anyway, we are open for questions. Dirk, please.
Yes, a lot of hands.
Well, I have an observation.
Dirk, sorry, I would collect first 3 questions and then we respond together.
First of all, thank you very much for the 2 presentations, which I found both very exciting. I mean, Carlo, what you presented to us is that there might be many solutions around connectivity and sharing, which might help us to shape our societies towards sustainability. This is what you mentioned and what you showed us, no? And then, Shivani, what you mentioned and showed us is that the basic challenges for all our societies for the last many generations of the past are not automatically being solved by digitalization. This is the question, the challenge of inclusiveness. It's the challenge of growth and development within the planetary boundaries, and how to embed power. But this is what you say. And there is no automatism from digitalization to manage these kind of challenges. And this translates for me into two questions or types of questions then. The first question probably to Carlo would be how to make digitalization work also for the bottom 40 or in some countries bottom 60% of the population, because the drivers of all of it, this is Saskia Sassen again, no, is moving towards solutions for the top 10 or 15% of the pyramid. And Carlo, most of your examples probably are very interesting and exciting solutions for the top 10 to 15%. No? So how to make this accessible and how to, for the bottom 40, and how to think about investments which drive into this direction of the excluded. No? And the second question to Shivani is probably, and to all of us, where on earth do we have innovation labs for the governance structures which we need to manage this kind of new challenges, Shivani, which you mentioned also. You said that inclusiveness, sustainability, and bad power will not be solved automatically. And in addition to that, there are completely new challenges. No? And where are the innovation labs globally to think about these kind of different challenges which are emerging now with digitalization?
Thanks. I think because we have two questions, maybe we want to answer briefly. But first of all, I disagree a bit about your characterization at the beginning. I think we're talking about two different things. You know, Shivani, she's talking about smart cities. We are giving the same name to the different things. Shivani is saying smart cities are neighborhoods for the rich with a lot of technologies. I would say smart cities are just Internet of Things applied to cities and can work for the rich and the poor or for everybody. Now, so there are two different definitions. Going back to your question, you know, how can this work for say, the global south or the lower part of the pyramid? But I think we see it every day. And, you know, every technology, by definition, usually starts at the top of the pyramid because, you know, at the beginning is more expensive. The internet was one example. I think this, also before smartphones, but just cell phones. Cell phones, you know, when they start growing very fast in the early 90s, they're very expensive and just very few people have them. They increase the divide. But then you fast forward just 10, 20, 30 years, and they become a tool for doing exactly the opposite. And so I think, you know, what we are seeing today is the same technology. Now you need to be careful from the beginning to analyze the gap, analyze the divide, and make sure that the technology has the potential then to reduce it. But we're seeing some beautiful examples. You know, I mentioned some of them before with the fisherman in Sri Lanka, with mobile transactions in Africa. I'll tell you another one. That's just one, but you know, but he could talk the whole afternoon. Is that at MIT we got an amazing guy who comes from Mongolia. Well, that guy would have been all of his life doing the life that thousands and that all of his family for hundreds and hundreds of years had been doing before, which was, you know, being just a nomad in Mongolia. But now, thanks to what is called MOOCs, which is massive online courses in education, which is, you know, what many of us at in university do. We teach a class, we record it, and everybody can look at them around the world, and then people can do exercises. Well, this guy started taking MOOCs from MIT, was scoring amazing, then started coming to the MIT campus, would have never, you know, even known about the existence of MIT before, and then has become a student at MIT, was in our lab, was in CSAIL, the Computer Science Artificial Intelligence lab. I didn't follow now what he's doing now, but I'm sure he graduated very, very well. Well, that for me is one example of the same technology based on Internet of Things. Again, is about connectivity in space, bringing information in space and responding back. New feedback loops across the planet that can have an amazing effect. For me, just that story of that single guy that had his opportunity was worth all of the development technology before.
Shivani?
Yeah, I don't have a problem with the Internet of Things or, you know, smart technology being applicable across cities. But when we look at the way smart cities, and I think, you know, models even in Europe and in Korea, for example, the way the smart city model is understood, it has a lot to do with governance. It has a lot to do about who makes decisions in cities and who benefits from the cities. So I don't know if it's just, I don't think it's just a different interpretation, but I think the smart city really is about creating a city with a certain style of governance and a certain manner of functioning, and good technology is part of it, you know. But the fundamental premise of a smart city is not an inclusive city in whatever I've read about smart cities across the world.
Says, huh? Or
no, not
Cisco,
necessarily,
yes.
but just if you look in South Korea, they've built cities from scratch, and they call them ghost towns. It's a city, they say they're cities without souls because there are no people living there, right? So when you try to fabricate something not based on the needs of the people or not based on the cultural richness and the traditions, you know, cities, as we saw in the presentations before, are organic systems, you know, they're self-sustaining organic systems that arise, and you cannot impose things on them. So if people have a say in the technology, there's nothing wrong with it. I do not have problems, you know. And as I said, I'm not against technological innovations. You know, smartphones have radicalized people's lives. They brought technology into people's homes. And there are so many advantages of smart technology. But it's the exclusive nature of this. It's the discriminatory nature of it. And it's looking at technology in isolation, which I find problematic. Because when you look at a city, there are very fundamental issues of land, right? Like of space. The spatial geographies, there are political binaries that are being created, and we need to look at them together. You cannot talk about technology without looking at land, without looking at housing, without looking at who makes decisions and who is at the table and who is not at the table. And I think these are fundamental issues of equality and justice that have to be integrated. You cannot have discussions on technology without looking at these issues of social justice, because I think the challenges that we are facing are not only in the global south. I mean, Germany has a very high Gini coefficient, you know, and I was alarmed to see that it's higher than some countries in the global south. So there are problems, there are inequalities within cities in Europe as well. But how do we address that is my question. So that's why I feel the human rights framework is the only way forward, because if you have indicators that, yes, how many people have smartphones is a good indicator to have, but how many people have access to secure housing, how many people have access to land and commons and natural resources, how many people are actually moving out of homelessness every year, you know, how many people are getting jobs. So you need a whole range of indicators that would then drive your governance. And I think technology has a huge potential to help us bridge some of these divides. But the way the experience is developing is it could increase the divides. And I'm just trying to raise these issues that we need to think about these frameworks. We need to think about the challenges, to be careful that we do not leave out, you know, the half of humanity that is still struggling to have 2 square meals a day. And that is the reality that I come from, that people are dying of starvation in cities like Delhi. People are dying of the cold in a city of Delhi just because they're sleeping on the streets. So there are very big challenges, and that's why a government that makes a decision to build a smart city should really first look at the poorest person to see how does it benefit them. And I really feel that an inclusive model could help everybody. We're not saying do not have Uber, but, you know, make sure that it works within, you know, your national regulatory frameworks.
But that's very much also the view of the German Advisory Council so far, that we need to proactively shape the digital transformation in view of the challenges we have in society for sustainability and all for the SDGs, which are, so to say, put down. Well, I've seen 2 other questions.
Yeah,
now many hands. So we'll try to collect. So
yes.
Her and then you, and then we take next round.
Okay. Carla Schulte-Stick from Berlin. I'm networking about sustainability. I was wondering if in all this discussion it's also thought about all the resources which are needed for this digitalization. And often it's lied to, sorry, my English is not so. It's with the problem with human rights also, because I think it's important to think also about that, to have the infrastructure for smart cities. You have still another problem about, you get what I want? Kann ich mal kurz auf Deutsch sagen?
Ja.
Entschuldigung. Nein, was ich bisher in der Diskussion ein bisschen vermisst habe, auch darüber nachzudenken, was an Ressourcenverbrauch natürlich auch mit dranhängt und natürlich dann, was häufig auch dranhängt mit Menschenrechtsverletzungen, dass das auch mitbedacht wird.
Okay, human rights we have been talking about already, and to the resources we can put the question forward to the panelists.
Und? Achso, kurze, was ich auch spannend fände, wenn man zum Beispiel mal wie bei dem Müll so ein, dass Klimawissenschaftler mitgeben würde, wie viel die fliegen. Das macht mich manchmal etwas unruhig, muss ich ganz ehrlich sagen.
Yeah, well, I think that those experiments really show what you can get out of some monitoring approaches to receive more insights, because indeed quite many effects we don't even know that they exist and how they evolve, and what are the reasons why it's going on like that. But we take the second.
From the World Cycling Alliance and the Scientists for Cycling Network. Thanks to all the three keynotes, also John Schellenhuber is not here, but his fractal cities and polycentric systems approach delivers, from my point of view, really some leeway for the human scale. And I guess this is maybe according to your, you were asking Ida for guidelines, how to come forward. I guess we really have to take into account the human scale. Otherwise we will talk about, yes, we need more people in, more behavior in, but we are talking about techniques, and the data. So, we have a slight disbalance, in my opinion. Thanks a lot, Carlo, that you were now talking about mobility, but exactly this delivers the example for what I'm talking about. You were showing us, and this was where we were laughing loudest all together, when you give the good advice, please don't try that, when we saw the cars all moving, driven by artificial intelligence on this intersection. Yes, you're right, the intersections are our problem for capacity building, but can you imagine that I saw a good video just a fortnight ago with real people doing exactly the same, but they were not sitting in cars, they were sitting on bicycles, or they were just walking around. And there it works quite well. So we have really to take into account also the adaptability, the human intelligence to build up really sustainable solutions. And as we know from all what we are working on sustainability is simply reducing non-sustainable behavior does not automatically lead to sustainability. We have to build up this from scratch, and this is different. And now this delivers the two questions I have. Can we really, Carlo, can we really use the internet and the Internet of Things and the data collection, even the big data? And we are so interested, I'm quite sure we can use this, for example, to get much better data for all participants of all means of transport, for example, or other examples. Or how can we use now your personal and good approach from India with this lots of people really to come forward and to use the human scale of all of them, because there's an incredible power in. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. So we start with the resource question. So the more digitization, the more problematic it becomes in view of sustainability?
Yeah. No, well, first of all, a couple of things. In the intersection, if you go on our website, there's actually all the section about, how it happens with people. It's not different. Today with people, you need to wait for your slot, like a traffic light. If you go to an intersection, you wait for the traffic light to let you go, and so you got a slot. It would not be any different than what you have there. So people are integrated in the system in the same way as they are today. But so that's not the point. I think that was more, a secondary point. I think the way we see our role, and I think if I look at the previous question as well, I think there's more to human life than solving problems. Many times, in the most amazing things we've seen is about following dreams. The internet was just a dream, was not solving anything at the beginning. And it turned out to be, forget what we said before, but it turned out to be probably in the way we access knowledge, in the way we connect with each other and so on, the greatest invention, something of the same magnitude of the printed press or the fire itself, in terms of how it transformed our lives. The way, today when I was studying at Cambridge University, if you needed an article, you had to go to the university library, and just to find a scientific article, you need 3 hours in order to go back and they had all the possible scientific articles published or archived and so on. Today you do it in 1 second on Google Scholar. So that accessibility of knowledge, the way we can actually get almost all of humans' knowledge and get it at our fingertips is an amazing thing that never happened before. And that happened not because people were trying to solve a problem, people are just following a dream. And I think what we need to be aware of is that a lot of the greatest things that we've ever created are because of that. Because if we start thinking just about optimizing, about solving this problem and that problem and so on, then we stay in the same paradigm. But the things where we really leap out of get out of the paradigm, we enter a new dimension, is when we're actually following something that usually doesn't solve anything, and then reveals all these kind of unexpected dimension. And I think that's very important, that we don't just look at optimizing something, we look at this, and to do this we need spaces for experimentation, spaces where people can be crazy in a city, in a space and so on. Yeah? Sorry?
The first question was about resource consumption.
No. Okay, maybe I misunderstood the question, but that's how I understood that the question was mostly, this was mostly the question about, anyway. So how was the question then? I'm happy to answer another question.
Well,
what was the question?
The question was English-German, so, well, basically, I think, if I translated it correctly, huh? Yes, exactly.
All right, sorry, okay, I understand. The one that was translated from German, I didn't understand the question, so I'm sorry, I didn't understand the translation, so I'm sure it was here clearly in German, but my German was not good enough. But if it is about the resource consumption digitalization, if I understand it, then the way that, yes, there is a consumption in networks, in digitalization, but in many cases, then you get many times back that consumption if you can optimize something else. So I think, yes, you have that, but if that allows you, to do something, if you have an intelligent building, that building will have, some little microprocessor and so on consuming energy. But if that allows you to save 30% of the energy of the building, you pay that back many order of magnitudes. So I think that applies to many of the things we're talking about. Yes, there's a consumption there, but if they do the calculation, you see that not all the time, but in most systems, then that allows you to save overall.
But to our best knowledge, there's no good study yet that really analyzes what's the relation between consumption and return of, well, say, investment. So if it's really superseding the resource consumption, but we will try to get to that.
If I can say something, yeah. Just, it usually happens naturally, because if you use just the metric of investment and return over investment, well, if you have a return over investment, it means that somehow you need to gain somewhere, and the only place where you can gain, if you do this, is in the energy. So overall, you might use a bit more energy on the digital side, but you save more on the physical side.
As I see already people leaving and we are running out of time, I would take the last round for 3 questions. 1, 2, Oh, no? Shivani didn't want to. No. We were checking and she didn't want to. Yeah. We do find a round anyway.
Eleonore Hame, wir arbeiten in einem sehr kleinen Forschungsprojekt auch zu Smart Cities. Da sind wir eigentlich sorry, we have to talk English, right?
And if you could make it short, that would be very appreciated.
Yeah, but
just
because
a question.
We came to a point to find out about a third approach, which is putting forward more the people, and it comes with the term smart citizen, which I don't like very much, but it talks about maybe more the potentials like participation, transparency, open data, whatever. And I think a very interesting example is the city of Barcelona, which is also showing the important role which cities could take, because they smarted with smart bins and all that shit. But now with the new government, they have a very interesting concept where they also say the city should see data and digital infrastructure as kind of public infrastructure, and should and not sell everything to big companies, but that really government, which is bound to human rights laws, should take an important driver's seat in this whole development. So I think that's just a very interesting development, and I would love to hear if you know more about these examples from other cities.
Okay, thank you. Where?
Oh, I thought that it's not my role, but thank you very much. I'm Antje Bruns from Trier University. I have a question that is maybe a little provocative and also directed to the whole audience, because I feel we are sort of missing the point when talking about global urbanization, which is in fact mostly about inequalities. And I was also wondering, in how far do we as scientists and academia really change our perspectives on what the urban really is? Because what we are discussing is that it's about infrastructure, mainly large technical infrastructure, but we miss on sort of studying the example from Lagos you showed us with the laughter in the audience when they asked you what's really new about it. And I think we can really learn a lot from studying southern urbanism, because they have a lot of solutions already in place, thinking beyond infrastructures, for example, so where people are the infrastructures in a more decentralized way. And I'm really missing that in this whole conference and during this whole event. I'm really sorry to say that. So Shivani, really thank you to your talk. That was really good and valuable to focus on very, very important points. Thank you.
Okay, and then I take there the last two guys with the questions. Yeah. Oh, no question? Okay, then we take the two. Shivani?
Yeah, thanks for sharing the positive experience of Barcelona, but we also have a lot of forced evictions in Barcelona caused by the housing crisis, and I think the mayor there is really trying to promote a more inclusive kind of urban development. I think there are good examples, and one framework that we could use is the right to the city framework, and we have cities like Montreal and recently Mexico City that have developed a right to the city statute. Brazil has a right to the city statute, and across Latin America there's a strong movement that is now also global, where people are saying that everybody living in the city has the right to the city. So I think these are the frameworks that we should really be promoting, and I think language is important. The term smart city is problematic. So let's talk about inclusive city, let's talk about human rights cities, and that is what the international legal framework does recognize, sustainable cities. And I think if we stick to these kind of terms, then I think it's much easier to develop indicators and avoid these kind of dichotomies that tend to come up. So yes, there are positive examples, and I think they're very interesting examples of people-led processes. I mean, Joseph spoke about social production of habitat, but there are also people-driven processes in many countries, including in the global south, where people are coming and rising up and taking decisions to make cities work in their favor for housing, for water, for sanitation. So I think we need to celebrate those and support those as well. And yes, you spoke about the potential of the human capital, and I think that's really important, because yes, I don't think that all solutions lie with artificial intelligence. We have very large labor force, and we need to ensure also that a lot of this automation doesn't put people out of jobs. So for example, when Uber, and we have an Indian company called Ola that arose to challenge Uber, and there was a lot of celebration. But then recently there have been a lot of strikes by local taxi unions who are out of jobs now, because they cannot give you such cheap fares as Uber, which is highly subsidized with capital investment. They need to feed their families, and they run their own taxis, and they're going out of business. So there is disruption in the workforce, and I think yes, we need to be aware of these challenges, and we need to make sure that people, that's why I said, are at the center. Thank you.
Okay, then I will do the last question to both of you. We've been asked to talk about potential or risk for sustainable development. So if I ask you again, what is one potential and one risk that we face with the digital transformation in view of sustainability?
But I don't know, I think we talked about some of the risk, the risk of cyber-physical systems, the risk of privacy, and so on. I heard in a point before, that maybe I was flattered as an Italian to hear that, we should learn more from Naples. And I need to tell you, today when I landed, I actually felt a lot like Naples. So maybe Berlin is learning, when I was landing, the radar at the airport was not working, so my flight was several hours late. I believe there's a new airport that's now slightly over time and over budget, I think. So I think then I couldn't find a taxi because of the rain. I couldn't get here, so I felt totally like Naples. So maybe we're learning from each other.
I'll start with the potential, and I think, as I said, there is definitely a potential for technology to work for people. I think in terms of especially sustainable energy, I think it's very important for renewable energy, for reducing ecological footprints if it's used in the right way. And I think there are solutions to even helping marginalized groups get up to speed and to use technology, as I said, like farmers or the fishermen in Sri Lanka. So there are potentials. But I think the biggest risk is that of exclusion and leaving people out. And given the kind of inequality that already exists in cities, I think it's a risk we cannot afford to take, because we need to make sure that we have an equal setting before we venture forward. So I think we need to bring everybody to the same level before we move forward. And I think that is the big challenge.
Thank you very much. That's very nice final statement. Thank you both. Thanks to the audience for your time, your interest, and the good discussion we had. Thank you.